Welcome to the Schar School Power Lunch. This week, it's a roundtable on national unity. Where does one of America's most divisive elections leave the nation? No referendum was ever going to resolve the fundamental questions at the core of the country's disputes. Who counts? Who belongs? Who matters? Vice President Joe Biden has repeatedly invoked the soul of America. Is there a path to renewing a singular sense of moral purpose that unites a diverse people? What is the path to American healing? The Power Lunch welcomes Tom Davis, former Republican Congressman for Virginia's 11th District and co-founder in 2010 of the nonprofit No Labels. Wendy Feliz, Director of the Center for Inclusion and Belonging at the American Immigration Council, and Tim Shriver, Chairman of the Special Olympics and founder of Unite. Well, what a day to be discussing national unity in these United States. Hi, everyone. I'm Justin Guest, an associate professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government. Welcome to the Schar School Power Lunch. I'm lucky today to be joined by Congressman Tom Davis, former congressman from Virginia's 11th District, Wendy Feliz, and Dr. Tim Shriver. Thank you all for joining us. Over the last decade, Americans of different political stripes have exerted enormous energy undercutting the very legitimacy of their political opponents. They have questioned their morality, they have questioned their patriotism, they have questioned their faith, they have questioned their rationality, they have questioned their belonging. And that is all culminated in a 2020 election in which both sides have hoped for a repudiation of the other side's politics and a validation of their own worldview. But we are left with an impasse that has left no one validated, no one repudiated, and all sides are clearly here to stay. Amidst Donald Trump's contestations, Joe Biden's likely narrow electoral college victory, and a split Congress, all this means that to respond to the current pandemic and try to stabilize the country, Democrats and Republicans and the various racial, religious, and cultural groups that they represent will need to work together to forge a new sense of connectedness. So the question is, what are the paths forward? Wendy Feliz, thanks so much for being with us. Yes, we are in a place where the president is demanding that some citizens' votes not count. But all this year, everything from Girl Scout cookies to Goya beans to masks in the interest of public health have all been refracted through the lens of political partisanship. Set the scene for us by explaining how have we reached this place?
Well, it's taken a lot of hard work to get here, but we're going, I think, in the wrong direction. I think we will spend a good amount of time talking about this today, but at the heart of what's going on is polarization, and it's a word we hear thrown around really often, but in particularly, it's this idea of social polarization. So what is social polarization? It's the idea that our political identities have become part of our social identities. It used to be the case that, our political identity was most active in the lead up to an election cycle, but now it's active all the time. And we are sort of expressing that identity on social media, right? We've broken down into these siloed groups. We've been able to be connected mostly to people who agree with us and who reinforce the way we think. And so in many cases, we fall into this space of groupthink, right? And sadly, what makes for a great meme or a great GIF at its heart is often dehumanizing the other side. And so we've fallen into these patterns, and it's very interesting because Americans will say they're tired of division, but then, the next thing they do is send you something that sort of dehumanizes a group that doesn't share their worldview or their values. And so I think that really is key for us to start reconciling how each and every one of us are contributing to this polarization, and that in fact we are the solution, and it kind of starts with each one of us as an individual. I know that's hard in a time where people feel like their values are under attack, but believe me, everyone feels that. or even feels like their group is under attack. So let me leave it there, but there's a lot to learn from behavioral science that is helping us understand why we're so polarized. But I think there's hope and lots of really good interventions we can begin to employ to see if we can turn the tide.
Thanks, Wendy. We're going to come to several of those themes shortly. Tim Shriver, you have worked in practically every corner of America's civic framework. You have been a teacher, you are on the boards of numerous universities and think tanks, and you run the Special Olympics. Despite the efforts of all of these organizations, is 2020 rock bottom? What has 2020 made you and maybe some of your colleagues rethink? Tim, I think you are on mute.
Sorry, I was being overly circumspect about my muting. I think the evidence suggests, Justin, that most people would agree with that premise that 2020 is rock bottom. Most people think the country is at a low point. Most people are struggling to find a path forward. Most people are worried that we don't have a path forward, that we're more divided than ever. Are we more divided than we were before the Civil War? Are we more divided than we were in 1968? I don't know. These are challenging comparisons to make. But I think what's clear is that there's a general sense of despair in the country right now about the division. Everybody I've talked to since the election is despairing, both sides, honestly. I've talked with Republicans and Democrats. And we're all seem to be throwing up our arms in disgust and despair. And I think the underlying thing I hear the most is we just don't understand how, and then you fill in the blank, how they could have voted for Donald Trump, how they could have voted against Donald Trump, what they're thinking. We just are throwing up our arms. And I'm going to argue, maybe counterintuitively, that level of exhaustion is an indication to each of us that the frameworks we're using aren't accurate. That we have to look more deeply. And I hope that the frustration doesn't lead to easy categorization. They're just stupid. They're just immoral. They're just this. If we can avoid that tendency right now in this moment, and say we've all got to put on. If I used children's literature, which I like to do, we all have to become a little bit of a Curious George. And I don't know if it's a little bit out of fashion now that story, but we've got to put on our curiosity caps now, and I hope engage in a period where our political leaders, our cultural leaders, and each other learn again how to approach one another with curiosity and with empathy and with a desire to understand. And as soon as people hear that, they're going to go, but I'm not going to agree with that other, but I can't tolerate. That's fine. My suggestion wouldn't be to say all of a sudden become wishy-washy. No, quite the contrary. Become curious. Because the stronger your conviction, the more you're going to need to understand those who don't have it. And the more you think you can crush them, whoever you are, the more you think you can steamroll the other person into submission, the less likely you are to be successful. So from a purely practical point of view, I hope we're ushering in an era where our exhaustion with division will yield to a certain curiosity and a certain willingness to listen that needs to be modeled. Now, we can try it on our own. Wendy, I agree with you. We can try it on our own, but we need models. We need role models here, because if the role models are all sending us the signal that we're going to crush the other folks, it's hard to separate yourself from that kind of venom. But if our leaders would just maybe, regardless of who wins, say it's time for a new tenor in the United States, I think we'd have a shot at using this moment as a turning point rather than an end point.
Well, let's talk about our leaders. Tom Davis, it seems like American voters are simultaneously exhausted, as Tim Shriver just said, of the polarization and the division, but they also don't want their side to compromise. Just last week, an Ipsos poll reported that around 40% of both presidential candidates' supporters said that they would not consider the other side's victory to be legitimate. And I think we're seeing that come to fruition in the aftermath. Take us inside the mind of the American politician at the national level, the folks that Tim Shriver just mentioned. They certainly don't seem courageous right now. They certainly don't seem principled in many ways. What are they thinking right now? Are they perplexed by their constituents? Are they scared? What are they thinking?
Well, first of all, let me associate myself with the remarks of the last two speakers. I think they made some great points. Let me get inside of the political head today and note that, for example, in the House of Representatives, fully 80% of the races, the only race that counts is the primary election, not the general election. So they hew their time, attention, and their voting records to primary voters who are a very thin ideological slice of the electoral pie. They're left on the Democratic side, right on the Republican side. These are the people that don't like compromise, that think they're right and the other side is wrong. And to these members, if you want to come back to Congress, you've got to win your primary, and that's all you worry about. You have about 20% that have some level of swing in their district that need to worry about both sides. But the majority in both caucuses are such that they just worry about their primary, so they're catering to their primary voters. And these single party districts have been a major cause of this, and the fact that primaries are driving political behavior. But in addition to that, now you've got a couple enforcement mechanisms on that. You look at the media model. People don't tune into the news now for information. Most Americans tune in for affirmation. They tune in, they want their worldviews validated, whether it's the websites they visit, whether it's the cable channels they watch, whether it's the radio they listen to. That just reinforces them and puts them in this bubble. And then in America, uniquely, despite our best efforts to try to reform campaigns, right now, we took the money away from the parties, which have been a centering force in American politics for 200 years. That money has now gone out to the wings, and it tends to be ideological money. As more money is raised, less from special interest groups and more off the internet, it's that ideological message that drives it, that drives the giving on this. And you can look, I can cite chapter and verse of where the more outrageous somebody is, the more money they're likely to raise. So those have been polarizing factors in America, unique to America. And on a global basis, just because of the rapidity of change, we're getting a lot of people retreating to the corners.
So, Congressman, are you saying that politicians feel overwhelmed by all of these this confluence of forces pushing them towards the extremes? Do they not feel like they can hit the brakes?
Well, you defeat one Eric Cantor and the Republican caucus goes ballistic. AOC upsets a leader in the Democratic caucus. And by the way, he'd been chairman of the Democratic Party in Queens. And all of a sudden, every other member doesn't want to be the next one of that. So the answer is members like getting reelected. And right now, all the political incentives are not to compromise unless you're in one of those swing areas, which even whether the Senate, but particularly in the House, you're not in a swing district for the most part. These are the members that have to worry about both sides. I had a swing district. I talked to everybody. I couldn't afford not to. But most of these people, they go back and they just worry about their primary. That's the incentives.
So is your conclusion then that we should not be looking to our leaders for this sense of unity, and this is something that we, the people, our civil society, should actually be trying to generate ourselves?
Well, I'll give you a couple examples of leaders. If you look at some governors with the highest popular ratings, the Republican governor of Vermont and Massachusetts and Maryland all have great ratings, and they have Democratic legislatures. These are Republicans that don't have to worry about their base. Their base tolerates them because they're the only people that can win. And they can, if you will be a little bit more earnest in governing. And the public reflects that. I think that even the returns on Tuesday giving us divided government now, which is really the new normal. You've got a lot of Americans that really want to be in the middle, but the people that drive it are these primary voters, and they're not centered at all.
Tim Shriver, many observers will say that there was a moment after Barack Obama was elected president in 2008 for the United States to unify under the pressure of a debilitating global recession that brought Wall Street to its knees. It was a great equalizer. Everyone was feeling a sense of pain. But the recovery only reinforced the inequities inside of American society and exaggerated many of our differences. We are now in another such moment 12 years later with a different kind of equalizer. It's a disease, of course. And again, our recovery appears to be reinforcing our inequities and exaggerating our differences and focusing us on identity politics. There is little doubt, I think, that President Trump has stoked and profited from national division, but how complicit are Democrats in our arrival at this nadir? You come from a proud Democratic family of politics, and I wonder what to get your thoughts as well.
Thanks for that easy question, Justin. I think what Congressman Davis has just said is really important. I just want to underscore it for a second. The incentives in the system, every person in a company, in a family knows that you want your incentives to be aligned with the outcomes you want to achieve, right? If you're a salesperson, you want the incentives to be aligned with how much you sell. If you're a manager, you want the incentives to be right. People spend their careers trying to figure out how to get incentives right. The incentives are all wrong. Both parties, the incentives are wrong. At some level, the internet is the new incentive destroyer, the new, I don't have a good quippy phrase for it, the new disincentivizer of healthy, hopeful, personal, social, and political transformation. And we've got to take that on too, because as the congressman just said, you don't go for information, you go for affirmation. And we know that these algorithms that pick up your phone, and the first thing you're going to see is something that that someone's getting paid to show you. You think it's just your platform. It's not your platform. People are getting paid to show you things, and the more they incite your fear and anger and need for affirmation, the more they're going to get paid. So I just want to say the incentives are off for Democrats, for Republicans, for all of us, right? We are not incentivized to actually pursue the goals, the dreams, the desires we most deeply want, the positive ones at least. We're incentivized to see hate and fear and anger across the board. I think both parties own a good deal of responsibility for that, although, of course, I have a certain bias that I think sometimes the Republican Party, forgive me, Congressman Davis, has made profound mistakes that I think have damaged our country. But I'm not going to get into a tit for tat here. That doesn't help anything. I think what helps us is to recognize, in part, the way in which this is a manufactured state of mind. That's what I heard Congressman Davis saying. This is not the way people think. It's the way the political system is forcing us to try to think, right? So that means already that intuitively we don't like it. We did a poll last year, it was mid-70s, don't like the way we are now. And then when you ask a follow-up question, do you know how to change it? They say no. Overwhelming majority say no. I don't like the way things are, and I don't know how to change it. Now, that's a big opening. And I would submit that there's actually another narrative going on in our country that's not red or blue, that's younger, it's more creative, it's more connected, it's entrepreneurial, it's diverse. It has focused on things like respect and tolerance and acceptance. It also focuses on values like honesty and transparency and service. That there's a whole current emerging in our culture on both sides that we don't see or hear anything about. I call these folks uniters. My friends sometimes call them, David Brooks has named them weavers. Tom, you and others have talked about people who are nonpartisan, post-partisan, pluralists. They're not, people think they hear Democrat when they hear this language. It's not democratic. If you go to a Special Olympics event, I'll just give you one quick example. We look at our volunteer base. Over close to 1 million Americans volunteer to run Special Olympics track meets and basketball games and bowling competitions a year. Predicated on words. Now think of what these words trigger. Tolerance. What do you hear? Do you hear left or right? Acceptance. Do you hear left or right? Diversity. Do you hear left or right? You know what the volunteer base is? It's about 55 to 60% Republican. Now, I hope you're going, wait a minute, right? You should go, wait a minute. You should go, wait a minute. So I think both parties, in answer to your question, Justin, own responsibility. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I also think both parties, if we were really interested, I'm going to make this sound maybe pretty blunt, but if political figures are really interested in making us the United States of America and getting us through this, they would have to, even at the risk of their own seats and even at the risk of their own political futures, take a chance on identifying and challenging their bases to move towards a unified, creative vision of the country and end the polarization. Now, that sounds very naive and idealistic and full of, maybe crazy thinking, and I'm never going to get funded to do this. I'm never going to get donations, and I'm never going to get reelected. Maybe that's true, but what an extraordinary moment it would be if whole dozens and dozens of people in both caucuses took some kind of a pledge and some kind of a commitment to recognizing that there's a new trend going on in the country, which I believe is there, just not well understood yet, and certainly not yet led to unite the country behind a new vision. Maybe it's the first time we've ever thought about this, actually the United States, not the different states, not the local states, not the tribal states, not the religious states, not the racial states, but the United States. I know that sounds just like rhetoric, but I think it's actually emerging, and that's one of the growing pains we're experiencing, is trying to figure out how to name it and lead into it from both sides of the political spectrum.
It sounds like rhetoric, but it sounds like Joe Biden's rhetoric right now. I mean, this is what Joe Biden has led with in the final days of the campaign and in the days since the election, and promising that he will govern for Democrats and Republicans, for all races, for all religions, whether you support him or not. This is his rhetoric. Now, whether he will practice what he preaches if he takes office is another story. But this is not, of course, the rhetoric, what we have heard from the Trump administration. And I want to bring Tom Davis back in again. You know, we are still obviously without a final result from the presidential election. But a defeat of President Trump does look likely at this point. If he loses, his performance does still suggest President Trump's continuing appeal that Trumpism will outlive Donald Trump inside of the Republican Party, your party. Should it? What is the path to unity, to the unity that we are discussing here today, when the president, the leader of the party and its spiritual leader going forward, it seems, when he has openly and unabashedly stoked division? What do you think should be the North Star of the party going forward?
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm a free markets guy. So in more of I guess, more constitutional conservative. But I would say Trumpism existed before Trump. If you follow what had happened in the Republican Party in the decades prior to that, the Republican base had migrated from the country club to the country. This had been ongoing when you track when you track the election returns. Republicans had been losing ground in the suburbs, and this was because of the emphasis on social issues. Trump saw this, and what he added to that is basically his populist trade policies and the like, which gave rural voters, particularly in the Great Lakes and upper in New England, who were culturally conservative. It let them know Republicans were no longer the party of Wall Street, and he brought them over in droves. I think there's I think for the short period of time, that is going to survive. But Donald Trump, without having a platform of the White House, the patronage to dispense, the ability to veto bills, he'll still have tweets, but I think they'll be paid less attention to. I think the Republicans over the next 4 years are going to be fighting and recognize that he was a very flawed messenger for the kind of things that he represented. His rhetoric was over the top in many cases. He was undisciplined. So I think his career is through. His influence may not be through, but I think we'll be having this conversation within the party over the next 4 years. By the way, as will the Democrats. Biden, if he decides he's going to be one term and doesn't want to run again at 81 or 82, has a tremendous opportunity to go against his base on some issues, not worried about re-election should he choose to do that. And with narrowed Democratic majorities in the House and probably a Republican-controlled Senate, that probably plays best to his instincts in a divided government situation more than it would, I think, any other candidate that was out there this time. So we'll see how it plays out.
I want to pivot now. Wendy, Feliz, you have founded an organization that is all about belonging. How do we operationalize belonging in this era? How do you build a country mobilized around belonging when you may not actually have support from the White House and you may not have support from Congress, when you may not have that leadership behind you? And Wendy, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm back. So I'm going to kind of riff off of what Mr. Shriver said, which is those things are already underway. So there are people who work in American communities who are already building the sense of, bridging differences, creating belonging, for people who don't feel like they're part of America or that their concerns are being heard. So that work is underway. The question is a lot of these groups that have been formed over time. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Think of the YMCA, or think of parks, or think of libraries, or think of museums, right? These are the institutions of American life, houses of faith. This is where people go, right? And then there's also places like grocery stores and Walmarts, all right, where people go. And this is how we interact on a daily basis in society. These places were not created to foster inclusion and belonging and bridge building and dialogue, but their programs can be modified and built out. So that's actually part of the work that they do, right? There's no reason why, if I'm going to a food bank, that there can't be an experience there for me that allows me to connect to my neighbors on a more deeper level, right? And so what we have to do, number one, is help civil society feel like that's their mandate now, is building bridges and creating more social cohesion and national unity. So that becomes part of their job. They're ready to do it. They get it. They're already doing it. And then the private sector, right? How are you more than just the grocery store where I go to get my eyeglasses and to get my groceries, but how are you a place where I can be more engaged in my community? You know, where we hang out together has really changed in American life, right? It's not the Elks Club and the Kiwanis Club and the Lions Club, right? And it's not, society isn't sort of organized in the way that it once was. Also, young people find a lot of meaning in places like work, right? Work becomes a really important place for socialization and connection. And so those kinds of activities being built out so that they're getting more engaged in community is important. So, you know, I'm not saying it wouldn't help to have a White House Office of National Unity, you know, Justin, which you and I have already argued could be very powerful because of the White House's convening power, because of the White House's power to galvanize resources, because of the White House's power to bring attention to issues that are going on. But whether or not we have a national coordination, group or office or committee, that work can still happen at the society level, at the civil society level, with private industry essentially coming down. But at the core of that work, which is really complicated, but really simple at the same time, is seeing each other's humanity. So the reason why we're not able to worry about someone else's problems, and I'm not necessarily fighting for other people's dignity and other people's equity, is because I'm not seeing their humanity. And you mentioned something, which some people call identity politics earlier as a dividing factor. Well, there's nothing wrong with going back to a group that you identify with and organizing for change and having an agenda. But that was never meant to be a final destination. You then come back and organize yourself with other communities around common struggles. And within those common struggles, we find common ground, right? In fact, we actually think organizing people around common struggles is probably more powerful than organizing people around common dreams. Because for many people in this country, the American dream feels very, very far out of reach. What is more resonant in their daily lives are the common struggles that they're facing. And so we can move people, and that's why I kind of often bring up this idea of class. Like, class is a really important discussion that, the Democrat Party doesn't spend a lot of time focusing on, and neither does the Republican Party. We did it one time many years ago, actually led by some of the family members of people on this call, right? Where really the Democrats were a party about class. We were a party about poor people. We organized unions. Now, that is a common denominator across race, across gender, across religion, across immigration status, is putting food on our children's tables, like caring about our children's future, trying to pay our electric bills and our credit card bills. That is a stark reality that gets very little play in politics these days, but I do believe that's a way we can organize people. So when we organize them across these common struggles, they start to see each other's common humanity. Then I can get you to organize for a change that impacts maybe my community a little bit more than your community. But as long as we're all separated and organizing separately, we're not having the same impact, and it's becoming a zero-sum competition. Who gets justice first? Who gets, resources first? And I think that's a little bit counterproductive. And we really need to figure out how to bind people back again across common struggles and use all of these sort of features of civil society to do that. Again, the YMCAs are already doing that. Let's power them up to do that more. Public libraries, they can be part of that. We have institutions in society that can do this, but they need pilot strategies. They need tables to convene and plan together. And yes, it would be nice if there was some kind of very powerful national office putting some energy behind the effort.
Thanks, Wendy. Let me just remind our audience that if you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to put them into the live chat box, and closer to the top of the hour, we'll get a chance to ask a few of them. Type them in and they'll appear on the screen later on in the program. Tim Shriver, your organization, your new organization, Unite, recently hosted the Call to Unite, which fundraised for COVID-19 relief with everyone from President George W. Bush to Oprah to Deepak Chopra. Where does this go from here, and how does it plug into the work that Wendy was just describing?
Well, first of all, I just want to come back to a point Wendy made and maybe ask Wendy a question. You know, I spent a lot of time, and a lot of my career has been in schools, in public education. And early on in my career, Wendy, there was a movement called community schools. These were schools which would have the capacity to be basically open almost around the clock. And during the day, you'd have obviously your traditional schooling format, but after school, there'd be activities and supports for kids, and maybe into the evening, there'd be opportunities for adults, for adult learning, for mental health and community and recreational services and other kinds of physical health supports. And the idea was very much what you've just described, which is that that schools that we typically thought of as occupying one lane, meaning the school is the place where you learn how to read and write, actually could become places of building civic and social trust and flourishing. And so we spent a lot of time trying to build a movement we call social and emotional learning, where we would teach kids and adults skills like stress regulation, like agency, like empathy, like active listening, and these kinds of things, and where we would inspire the community to feel the school as a place for the development of the whole child and, in fact, the whole community. So I guess I'm wondering, as I see this, you know, I'm seeing this maybe, you know, as they say, the carpenter sees everything with a hammer and a nail. As an educator, I see maybe everything through the eyes of the school or through education. I wonder if schools couldn't be at the vanguard of not only teaching Americans, and I'll get to your point, Justin, about Unite, because a lot of what Unite wants to do is, in a sense, strengthen the skill, strengthen the muscle we have for relational trust and relational understanding. That's, in our view, what's been weakened. Strengthen that muscle through concrete action, right? That you could do to strengthen schools, strengthen collective action around COVID. The president-elect, if there is a president-elect in the next day or so, could announce that we're trying to do this collectively, cooperatively, in conjunction with all the factions. Everybody gets a voice at the table. It's a collective disease. We need a collective response. I don't know. I just wonder whether you see in schools or in these potential mobilizations right now, the potential to actually not just tell people we should unite or tell people we should trust each other, but actually put it to work.
Absolutely. I mean, public schools are a pillar of our society. You know, my son went to a community school. I was new to my town. I made my friends. I still have my coffee klatch with those mothers in common, even though our kids are all out of the house. So, you know, schools are an incredible way to foster belonging. And being a parent is an identity that people really feel in a very close way, right? The stakes are so high when you're a parent. And so it very often allows you to like get beyond the other identities. There were Republican parents at our school. There were Democrat parents at our school. We had different races and ethnicities. I know some schools can often be homogenous in some parts of the country, so it may not always be the right place to build bridges. But that's still, like, there's lots of places where it are. America's changing very quickly, and we're all parents. Like, at the end of the day, we want the best for our kids. So I think schools can be really, really powerful models. And if you had a White House Office of National Unity, just saying, you could coordinate the work of the Department of Education and others that could, you know, sort of advance that kind of the resources getting to the school, the thinking getting to the school. So it's not just about test scores. It's about, you know, gauging the social emotional learning of the child. It's about gauging their social connection and cohesion and every community's social cohesion as to whether that school's serving like as a real hub to build community. So yes, I'm totally on board with your idea.
Yeah. Well, it was a little bit of a layup question, but thank you for affirming it. Justin, let me just double back then on the issue of what Unite is trying to do. I think our premise here is that we need a new story, that we need a new way of solving problems, the way Wendy's just described, We need a new mindset. And so Unite is, all we did is we asked Republicans and Democrats, as I've said, ex-presidents and ex-convicts. We asked children and senior citizens. We asked healthcare workers and teachers. We asked people of all racial and ethnic persuasions, sexual orientations. Are you willing? Would you offer? How could you answer the call? If the call came to you to unite the country, how would you answer it? And Americans, it turns out, have extraordinary willingness to try. We don't need a lot of support for this. We do need a little. And our vision at Unite is that we can help tell the story to create the space that Congressman Davis was saying. Maybe a lot of political figures would like to have the space to move, but feel tied to a more caustic agenda on either extreme. We try to create the space, model the skills, maybe even teach the skills. You can go at unite.us right now and you can hear classroom teachers teach lessons around mindfulness and around self-regulation, around team building. My theory is, like, if second grade teachers know how to teach second graders those skills, why can't they teach the rest of us? So we've got their videos up there and lots of projects that people can join and be a part of, just to kind of put on, I almost think of it as a second identity. So I have lots of identities. So does all of us, right? We have gender identities, ethnic identities, religious identities, sports identities. We have country of origin identities. There's dozens of them. Make a list. Make a list of all yours. And then next to that list, put one more identity, uniter. You don't have to stop being a Mormon or a Catholic or Jewish or Muslim or a man or a woman or from North Carolina or from North Dakota. You can be all those. And in addition, be a uniter. And that means that my tribe, my sense of belonging is safe, and my openness to everyone else is always available. And if we can figure out how to hold those two together, that's the mission of Unite, to help people see that's not only possible, but much more likely to make you happy in your marriages, in your families, in your communities, and in your schools, in your neighborhoods. It's also more likely to help your country to solve the biggest problems, the biggest pain points, as Wendy rightly put out, that we're all feeling today.
Wendy, why is work that builds bridges and fosters belonging a key building block to resolving all these other issues plaguing America, like racism, like xenophobia, like political polarization? Wendy, I think you're on mute again.
Sorry. It goes back to what I said before, is you have to start by actually caring about somebody before you're actually going to fight for their dignity and for their fair place in society. And I kind of want to define belonging, because I think it's a word that people have heard and gets potentially kind of thrown around. But what do I mean when I say belonging? What I mean is that we live basically in a society and in a collection of societies that were created and shaped by a majority group, by one group that decided kind of this is how it would be. And then everybody who has come since had to adapt to that society, right? And be like the dominant culture wanted people to be like. It's not working anymore, where it's like we're asking people to integrate or assimilate or, act a certain way in order to be included in society. So the idea of belonging is something called co-creation. It means we decide we're going to create spaces. We're going to create a society where everybody gets to show up with all their identities, with all the parts of themselves. And they don't have to hang one up in order to come in the room. They don't have to be less of anything. They get to be everything. But that means the dominant culture in those spaces has got to be willing to create those spaces where everybody can feel fully themselves and contribute fully themselves. Because then once we can do that, right, and we don't have to switch ourselves up in order to participate, right, then we can start having the conversations that we need to have around solving common problems. And then we start to share what those common problems are. But I think what's really difficult for a lot of people right now in this country and their frustration is that they're being asked to adapt to one way of doing things, one mindset, one culture. And that really has to shift. And I know that's hard for the dominant culture. Of course it is. No one likes to lose power. No one likes to give up. But if we don't start figuring out how we can do that together and make sure everyone feels like they have a place where they do belong and where they are safe, we can't solve those problems, right? And what we're in now is a competition. It's a very, very fierce competition where people are not willing to give up. I'm not willing to give up my identities. We used to, call America the great melting pot. I don't want to have to give up all my identities in order to belong anymore. This generation is not going to do that. And so how do we not make the cost so high to be part of things? We have to allow people to bring kind of all of their identities. And so to me, that is like such a key part before we can get to, dealing with lots of really, really difficult issues. It's not to say there aren't people willing to deal with some of the issues around racism and xenophobia, but there's a whole lot of people not wanting to do it because they don't feel safe. They don't know how to start. And their political identity or other social identities have told them to avoid it at all costs. And so it's complicated, but I really think if we kind of started at a more basic level of just starting to reconnect, even if it's over like through a school project, through things like that, where I start to see your humanity, I start to see you as a person. Now I actually care about what's going on. And then the other thing is listening. We have to set up tons of interventions and strategies for people to listen to each other, because we don't know how to do that. And listening, being heard, is literally a gateway drug to empathy. Like behavioral science shows us that. If you listen to me, I'm going to listen to you. And then you start getting in this virtuous cycle. We don't know that. We come with our facts, we come with our ideas, and we kind of want to stand on our ground and tell people what we think. But we have to start figuring out how to listen to each other. And it goes back to curiosity, right? We have to be anthropologists trying to understand each other, right? Otherwise, we're just in this terrible split screen where there's two Americas. Each America thinks the other one is nuts. We judge each other, we dehumanize each other, and we're not getting anywhere fast. Sorry, I went off on a little riff there.
No, not at all. Let me bring Congressman Davis back in. Congressman Davis, you were one of the founders of No Labels, a group that helped form the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus back in 2010. And they've called themselves a counterweight to the political extremism cannibalizing both sides, quote unquote. What comes first, solving polarization among our leaders or among the public? Do leaders need to stand for unity before we can expect the public to follow, or do leaders follow the public?
Well, leaders follow the public, but unfortunately, as we discussed earlier, the way that elections are constructed at this point, the fact that you have so many single party districts. Look, you've got residential sorting patterns where people like to live around people like themselves and the like. I think you're going to need some political leadership to make this work. And the Problem Solvers Caucus and No Labels has started on the front that we've got to get to the table and then sit and talk and listen to each other to try to move the ball downfield. Most members who run for Congress really have the good of the public in mind. They're not particularly have it's my way or the highway. I mean, you have some on both sides that are that way, but most members come all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed to Congress really wanting to change things, but they find right away that the incentives work the opposite way if they want to get reelected. So what we've done with our caucus is it's a Republican, Democrat. We keep an equal number. We meet once a month. We have senators and House members. It's probably 60 members at this point. We feel now with Congress closely divided that we can have a real hand in making things work and organizing and giving a President Biden and a Mitch McConnell ability to work together. But what we've got to understand is the two sides don't trust each other. There is no trusted medium right now. Back when I was growing up, you had Walter Cronkite, who was a trusted figure. There's no figure in the news that is widely trusted by both sides anymore. You might like Fox or MSNBC or the mainstream media, but I think they have been so trashed along the way, and they've been wrong on so many issues on all sides, that it's going to have to start with some political leaders showing some leadership. And that's something that has been in very short supply for the last couple of decades.
Congressman Davis, do you think, if I could ask you, do you think
Sure.
that a President Biden, I mean, I'll ask this just in the bluntest possible way, could he be a transformational leader in this particular moment around these issues?
Look, because I don't think he's focused on his reelection, he could be a one-term transformational figure. He has the potential to do that. But let me walk the other side. The House is narrow. The Senate is narrow. you're going to have each party caucus is going to take a look at each issue and say, does this advantage us or disadvantage us toward the midterms? And every time that President Biden walks across the aisle to embrace the Republicans and some of their views and try to bring those into some policy formulation, he's going to get beat up by members of his own party. Yesterday, the Democratic House members had a 3-hour phone call with members from marginal districts yelling and screaming at members from the safe districts. It's very, very difficult. But I think he's got probably more than anybody else the potential to do this because, A, he's an institutionalist, having come from the Senate, being there a long, long time. And secondly, the fact that he's probably one term, he has that ability. I think there's still a lot of distrust. This distrust, by the way, is fueled by the media. These media models are based on polarization. It goes back to 1986 when the Federal Communications Commission did away with the fairness doctrine and talk radio sprang up. But this has been replicated now where people, where news outlets, websites just cater to one side and people tune in every day to get their fix. So it's very, very difficult. But yes, I think he has a unique opportunity given the alignments we have. I'll also add this. I know President Bush tried to do that and met with opposition from Democrats who just saw it was better for them to dig in. And we saw the same thing with President Obama, who tried to move over to the other side and got beat up by his own caucus, saying, we got the votes, let's do it our way. It's very difficult undertaking. But I think given the closeness of Congress at this point and the fact that Joe Biden's probably not focused on re-election, he has a unique opportunity, but it's still a tough fit.
There's a very strong appetite for a lot of institutional reform in the United States, Congressman Davis, even as outlandish and far-fetched as it may be, because it's so challenging to pass institutional reform constitutionally. If you were to pass one institutional reform, would it relate? What do you think drives this impediment to national unity? Do you think it's the scrap for campaign funding? Is it primary elections? Is it the absence of term limits? Because you're focusing a lot on the limits of terms.
No, Justin, I will just tell you, from a legislative point of view, the one thing that you could do that would make legislation easier to pass and make it more bipartisan would be bringing back earmarks. Because then everybody's got a vested interest in getting to yes, because they get something to bring back to their district. We did away with earmarks. It's hard to personalize a district anymore. That's why we have these parliamentary voting patterns, because all members do is they sit up and they either vote the party line or they don't. If they don't, they lose their primary. If they do, they're subject to the partisan whims of their constituencies, which in most cases, they're pretty one-sided.
And Congressman, could you just explain earmarks for the benefit of our audience?
So I'll give you a good earmark. Woodrow Wilson Bridge. And Congress was able to get $600 million to complete the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, rail to Dulles, 123. My constituents in Fairfax County may not have liked my party. They never voted for my presidential candidate, but they saw some redeeming qualities in keeping me around because I was able to deliver for them on issues that were important to them. We've taken that ability away from House and Senate members at this point. So all they do is they sit in these caucuses that behave like it's a parliamentary system and they balance the power structure. It just doesn't work. But the earmarks is the ability to decide where specific spending goes for projects in districts. And by the way, it's less than 1% of federal spending.
Very interesting. Tim Shriver, you authored an op-ed in the Washington Post back in May, and you wrote, what our society looks like after this crisis, referring to the pandemic, depends on our collective understanding of the threats posed by inequity and the work we do to address them. If you were to set the scene for the next president of the United States and you were to urge him on what to do, the first steps to take, what would be the first move you would urge?
Well, that's another layup question. Great question, very difficult to answer. I'll give you a couple of thoughts. And these are consistent with, I think, what Wendy was suggesting, what Congressman Davis was suggesting before. I think, first of all, the transition ought to be completely different. Transitions are typically dominated by, the appointments of to federal offices, the selections of the high levels of the cabinet, preparation for the pageantry of an inauguration. I think it's within a Vice President Biden or a President-elect Biden's reach to model becoming the listener in chief, to open the door immediately to conversations that where he could be the listener in chief with people who didn't vote for him. So rather than modeling the delivery of patronage and power to your base, nothing wrong with that. Everybody does it. He should and will probably have to do that to a large extent. And that's a good thing. That's the way politics works. But he should model that he will do this with an openness and a attentiveness to the states and the voting blocs that don't understand and don't agree with him. I think right away you'd get a change. I think secondly, to Wendy's point, I think the consideration of a special assistant for American unity, a person whose job it is to identify the moonshots that unite the country. There is no one. There's a national security advisor who's advising the president on security. There's domestic policy council advisors. There's cabinet officials who advise on energy or education or employment or defense or state or law. There's no one in the United States government whose job it is to identify the moonshots that could bring us together. Now, you could say that's the office of the American president, and well, it should be. But the office of the American president needs a little bit of constituency building, to Congressman Davis's point. He needs a little cover. She or he needs a little bit of a base. So this office could be the person who is cultivating the conversations with Americans about the ways in which we could transform the culture. And then I think third, probably the most important thing to Wendy's point about pain points is, I think this president should execute his response to COVID, his response to racial injustice and racism, with a new strategy for building broad cross-sectional teams of activists from the bottom up and the top down who come up with creative solutions, not just bipartisan solutions, because bipartisan, most people hear, I got to compromise. Maybe we do, but maybe there are big transformative solutions that we just haven't thought of because we haven't listened deeply enough, as Wendy pointed out earlier. We haven't been curious and open to each other. We haven't actually, if you're a Democrat, you grew up like me, you didn't listen to Republicans, you beat them, right? And I'm guessing, Congressman Davis, you didn't listen. I don't mean to impose my view, but you probably didn't think your job was to listen to Democrats. Your job was to defeat them.
I was campaign chairman 2 cycles. Right?
Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
So we know how this works. And we know now where it takes us. It's not a bad thing to have a competition of ideas, but when it's unchecked by a commitment to a united future, then it spirals out of control. So I think the vice president or the potential president-elect, maybe as soon as the next few hours, I think he could run the transition differently. I think he could appoint new kinds of people within the executive branch, not just ceremonially, but significantly empowered people. And I think he could move forward on COVID and on race in particular. On education would be my third area where I think you could move forward decisively in ways that advance the agendas of his base with the consent and support of his opponents in ways that people will go, oh my God, I didn't see that coming. That's great. And if it's a one-term presidency and that's all he does and he retires, a historian friend who says the only real person who's seen this office, not as the head of your political party, but as the head of the United States, was George Washington. And you go back to Washington, I don't mean to be a historical buff here, but you go back to Washington's farewell address, and what he describes in that farewell address is the necessity of the president acting differently than every other elected official within the system of government, as the person who leads the whole. And I think President Obama tried. I think as Congressman Davis, I think President Bush tried. I think President Clinton tried.
Clinton actually did it.
In some ways, maybe President Clinton was the most successful. But at this point, we need a reshaping of the way in which the office operates if he's going to have, if a new president is going to have a chance to do the job. And I think it's doable. Difficult, but doable.
Thanks, Tim. And these are only difficult questions when you haven't thought.
Yeah, I know it. Yeah, they're short and punchy, but man, are they tough.
They're only difficult when you haven't thought as profoundly as you have. That's a really great answer. Thanks so much. Wendy, do you have some thoughts about how you would advise a president-elect here?
Well, I love listener in chief, so I think we gotta like trademark that, because that's absolutely what any president should be. The one thing that was coming up for me are non-traditional role models. I mean, the honest truth is the elites, politicians, people in Washington, they've suffered a blow. Not a lot of people feel connected or don't have a lot of trust. And so we really need to, be thoughtful about who can the role models be. Who it's not always politics and politicians. While we need politics and we need politicians, and obviously they can be incredibly powerful role models, we need to look outside of that, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up Dolly Parton, because I always bring up Dolly Parton, but she is a true unifier. She is such an intelligent and strategic communicator. And there really are people like that in our country that really cross the boundaries of polarization, who really cross the boundaries of division, and I think can be really healing. So I think we need to think about how we bring those people in and ask them to be part of the solution, do their national service for the country, and get more deeply engaged in that. And, that's the case, is that a lot of different people have different levels of credibility. But what's most challenging really is that most Americans, the most faith they have is in their family, in their peer groups, in their friends, maybe for some, some of their faith leaders, and there's a few more official leaders peppered in. But if we're living in a society where basically I just trust the people I know, right? How do you start setting really positive social norms, right? And how do you start really supporting something we call in-group moderates? Or how do you support the people within groups who are willing to correct behavior and say, hey, it's not right. I don't think that's right that you called a Trump supporter that word, or I don't think it's right that you called a Biden supporter that word, right? And so we need to really kind of power people up to be able to speak up and be better role models. So it's kind of like a range of role modeling that we need to build out. And there's ways to do that. But, it's not all on the politicians. They're really, really important. But there's other wonderful role models in society. And some of them are us, our own, and kind of breaking that cycle of disrespect and dehumanization.
Some of them are you. That's what you mean.
Right.
Which is true. It's really true.
Can I just add something? I mean,
Please, I was going to ask you.
One of the big polarizing issues has been race, going back to Minneapolis and some of the tragedies that took place this year. But if you look at California, they had an affirmative action, a question on that on the ballot, and it was rejected in California. This is a very complicated issue for people to talk about, and it's an issue. If there's anywhere you need to do more listening, it's on that basis, to get into the head of the other person and understand how they feel and the like. But it's an issue that the political system has totally said one way or the other. And I'd be interested in what the others have to say about this. But that's been central, I think, to alignment and everything else in politics.
Yeah. I mean, my view on this is probably polarizing in some respect. I do believe that racism is America's original sin. I do believe we have used racist and racism in our institutions and in our culture to advantage some people and disadvantage others. And at the same time, I believe there are most people are people of goodwill. That's just my fundamental view about humanity. And if given the chance, they would deepen their understanding of their brothers and sisters. And many people who look racist deep down don't want to be. Some, of course, do. And some are just, hope in some ways, I wouldn't say hopelessly, but deeply poisoned by racism. But I think, Congressman Davis, my view is that racism in some ways highlights that at its core, I think we're living to some extent in a spiritual crisis. Let me just try to justify that at some level. At some level, what I think I hear Wendy and others saying is that deep down we're afraid. And maybe deep down we've been afraid from the beginning of this country. And maybe that fear has fueled the hatred and the need for control and the need for dominance, the need for superiority for people who look like me, by people that look like me. But I think it's run its course. And I do think 2020, regardless of where we go from now, I think historians will say something changed dramatically in our country. And I think it's when racism was finally left the pages of legislative, maybe in the 60s, this was about the Voting Rights Act and civil rights legislation. And now it's migrated to the heart of the country. I think we felt collectively an awakening to the pain in the heart of our Black and brown brothers and sisters that maybe we just ignored, or maybe we refused to see, or maybe we just willingly wanted
Tim,
not.
I would agree with that. I think the question is, how do you proceed on that?
Yeah.
Just like a lot of issues, I think there's a consensus. There's an issue that needs to be addressed. I think sometimes we start off by over addressing climate change. We start off with where we're going to close the coal mines.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of rhetoric that instead of having a conversation
Right.
and then figuring out what to do, that we tend to jump ahead. And they just seem to me to be very, very polarizing and eliminate part of the people from the discussion at the outset.
Yeah, I think, when I talk to my friends who've experienced racism, what they ask most for is honesty. Mm-hmm. And I think it would go a long way. I mean, it's not solving the problems of income inequality and housing inequality and job opportunities, educational inequality. It doesn't solve those problems. It doesn't create equity to listen, but it does communicate a certain empathy, a certain compassion, a certain willingness to face the truth. And, I was down by Union Station the other day, and on the top of our national train station, Union Station, are the words, "The truth shall set you free." And I think we need a little bit of truth before we can move too quickly to the rules that we want to implement to force changes in behavior. I just would say one other thing that I think has been very divisive, and I'll say this about my own party. I think the way our party has treated religion and religious faith has been a source of tremendous humiliation to many people who pride themselves on their faith and who see their faith, biblical or non-biblical faith, as being fundamental to their identities. I think many times we have politicized religion to the advantage of both parties rather than in some ways spiritualizing our politics. And I think it's time, I think this is another thing President-elect or President Biden could do, which is to make it safe for you to bring your faith to the public square, not to force other people to agree with you on your religious views, but to open the heart, if you will, of the person of faith to the public square. And for many people in politics, I don't know about you, Congressman Davis, but most of the people I knew in politics, especially when I was younger, went into politics in part because their faith animated their desire to make a difference. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. And we've got to find a way to harmonize our national discourse in that area too, I believe, if we're going to reduce the stress that people of faith feel at being humiliated by those who come at it a little differently.
I want to take a moment to thank you guys. We're going to open things up to our audience's questions. This was a fascinating discussion so far, and it's only going to get more interesting when we hear the remarks from our audience members. Before we do, let me just take a moment to plug next week's also is going to be a fantastic discussion. It's going to be around healthcare policy, which could not be more important given the context of the coronavirus pandemic. We're going to be joined by the former majority leader of the Senate, Tom Daschle. He'll be with Zeke Emanuel, the superb oncologist and healthcare policy expert from the University of Pennsylvania and the Center for American Progress, and also the New York Times healthcare policy beat writer and investigative reporter, Sarah Cliff. Please make sure you join us next week at 12 p.m. right here on the Schar School Power Lunch. Before we turn to audience member questions, there'll be a 30-second break just for a quick message from the Schar School of Policy and Government, our sponsor, and then we'll be right back with you with audience members' questions.
A world in motion. Our next generation of leaders needs new tools, sharper skills, leadership vision, and policy acumen to succeed in today's environment. A hands-on interdisciplinary education that offers a national and global perspective on the complexities of governance. The Schar School, a vision of excellence that melds theory with practice in the spirit of advancing the public good.
Welcome back to the Power Lunch. Let's bring in our panelists again, and let's take a look at our first question from the audience. This is from Michelle Conklin. Couldn't part of the solution here be to base redistricting on what makes sense from a geographical standpoint to diffuse the extremism and encourage candidates to run who are willing to compromise? I think, Congressman Davis, you are probably best equipped here to answer this question maybe first.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I headed up the redistricting efforts in 2002 for the Republicans. And my wife drew my district in Virginia. So she was head of the House committee that drew the district. So I'm very well familiar with it. And by the way, I supported, even when the Republicans controlled the legislature, our effort to bring this to a commission basis in Virginia. Look, the only requirements you have on redistricting are the fact that the districts have to be equal in population, and that you have to comply with elements of the Voting Rights Act, and whether that survives or not with the court, we'll wait and see. But let me just tell you, the end result of the Voting Rights Act is when you pack minorities in districts, you bleach the districts around it. So the end result, basically, except for one seat in the Atlanta suburbs, is in the Deep South, all you have are white Republicans and black Democrats who worry about their primaries and no need to talk to the other side. But the major reason for these single party districts is not the Voting Rights Act or gerrymandering. It's the residential sorting patterns. The fact that people like to live in neighborhoods around people who think like they do. And Bill Bishop wrote a great book called The Big Sort on this. Describes his neighborhood in Austin describes the city of Austin as a city surrounded by Texas. But he talks about his neighborhood barbecue, and one of his neighbors comes up to him and said, "Oh, what a wonderfully diverse neighborhood." He said, "Here we have Muslims and Jews, we have blacks, we have Hispanics, we have Arabs." He said, "We have LGBT. What a diverse neighborhood." And Bishop looks at him and said, "Yeah," he said, "but do we have any Republicans?" And he said, "I don't think so." So that is the groupthink that was you talked about in your opening comments survives nowhere more than, by the way, in academia. But that is the difficulty. And when we talk about diversity, is not diverse. We're not mixing up and understanding the other person. And so in redistricting, I think, going to more geographically centered, I think makes a lot of sense. But you have these other, you have other pressures on it. I think going to nonpartisan commissions is a much better way to do it. California's done that, Washington State, New Jersey, and now Virginia. But it's not a complete solution because of these residential sorting patterns.
Thanks, Congressman Davis. I'm not sure if there are any thoughts from Wendy or Tim, or should we move on to the next question? All right, to the next question, please. Oh, this is from the Call to Unite's webpage. This is talk about layups, Tim. This is your own organization asking a question here. And I love basketball metaphors, by the way. This is more like a free throw. Given that it's likely to be a divided government with the Senate in Republican control and the presidency in Democratic control, how will they be able to address the most important issues of the day in divided government? I'm going to say that this doesn't go to Tim, but maybe this goes to someone like Wendy.
Only fair.
This is almost like the Congressman.
I don't know. Were they listening? I thought we answered this question already. Wendy, you go ahead now. Apparently my answer wasn't good enough before. Go ahead.
Let me just say, from a policy perspective, it really depends on McConnell and the president.
Oh, no, I mean, it was perfect. I don't think you can say it enough. It's bipartisanship, right? I think that would be fantastic. I've been thinking for the last 2 days, this may not be the election anyone wanted, but this might be the exact thing that we needed. And, I do think what you guys said earlier is so true that, Mr. Biden or President-elect Biden potentially has a history of doing bipartisanship. I believe the Senate was bipartisan, in an earlier iteration, and so was the House. And so I think if there is a person to meet this moment, it really could be him. And maybe it's a good thing that it's a divided government. Maybe we got to eat our vegetables. And so, and if we don't, then I don't really know what that means for our country. If we really, with these really thoughtful leaders who are about to take over, if we can't figure our way forward, I'm not hopeful that the next iteration in 4 more years that we'd be in better shape. So hopefully this is just what we needed, and we'll have to wait and see.
Wendy, I thought you were going to do the Rolling Stones song there for a minute. I thought you were going to turn into "You can't always get what you want, but you try sometime, you get what you need." Listen, I'm impatient for change in the issues that matter most to me. And in some ways, I'm sure many of my friends who come from more conservative perspectives have an equally impatient desire for change in the things that matter to them. And both of our interests from that point of view would have been better served by a united form of government, no division. on their side and on mine. But I want to just underscore what I think Wendy has said. We need creativity now more than we need force. We don't need the domination of one side over the other. We need to unlock a new spirit of cooperative, creative ingenuity to solve the problems of the 21st century. Old-fashioned Democratic politics and old-fashioned Republican politics can't do it. As much as I could say these 3 or 4 or 5 legislative changes are necessary to advance what I think is important, I also know that what I think is important is not the only important thing anymore. Because our country, I hate to make this sound kind of apocalyptic, our country is on the brink. So all of us who are feeling stressed, angry, frustrated, despairing of the other side, my hope is that we just take a beat and recognize that maybe, as Wendy just said, maybe the other side is what we need to help us achieve the goals which we so impatiently want. And if we thought about it that way, as uncomfortable as it may seem, that your opponent might be the key to your success, then we have a chance right now. And I go back to what Congressman Davis said in the beginning, maybe all the incentives on this are wrong, but maybe, as the great poet Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, wrote, maybe hope and history will rhyme right now. And the longed for tidal wave will rise up that so many of us are hungry for, even if we can't name it. Maybe we can't even describe it, but we can sense that we want something different. And maybe, I know I'm an idealist, but maybe we can take baby steps toward achieving it now in this moment in a way that we might not have been able to had one party prevailed.
It's time for Americans to eat their vegetables. Let's just hope people wouldn't rather starve. All right. Well, it was a good question. You getting questions from your own organization. It's kind of like the congressman being redistricted by his wife. All right. Let's take the next.
I hope he won after that redistricting. That's all I can say.
I said, don't give me too many Republicans. I'll have a primary.
Yeah.
Just a few more.
Let's take the next question. This is going to be Wendy's husband now. All right. This is from Honda. Not the company, I assume, because we don't have a sponsor yet. Although if you want a sponsor, you'll reach out and be in touch. Don't online communities undermine the unifying effects of most of the social interactions that we have? People interact passively at the grocery store, but online communities are active and isolated. So Wendy, I think this actually gets to your point about where Americans connect these days. Church attendance has gone down. Associationalism has dropped. A lot of this has, led to a sort of rise of associationalism online. What can you respond to Mr. and Mrs. Honda here?
Well, I mean, that's an easy one too. I mean, obviously the online communities without a doubt can, give us lots of confirmation bias. And, that's where you read things and hear things that you agree with. And I equate that to like eating like a really nice warm piece of bread with butter on it. It's like the best thing ever. Well, that's what it's like when you hear people confirm your views, your worldview. And so I think it's just very easy to get in those spaces and just hear a lot of things that confirm your view. But that's why they're not particularly helpful in helping us build out our curiosity, right, that we've been talking about. And I think that's not only social media, that's also cable news, right? And so if we're constantly having our worldview confirmed, there's very little reason to challenge it. And I think a lot of that goes back to a criticism of social media, but also traditional media, the consolidation of media, the inability to get really kind of solid perspectives that are different than what we think about. There's a great piece that was written a couple of years ago by Amanda Ripley, and it's called Complicating the Narrative. And you should read it because, Amanda's an old-time journalist, and what she argues is that, journalists are falling into this habit of he said and she said, and that's the end of the story, and they really disagreed. And they're not digging deep enough always to give us the nuance and the understanding that we need. So, I think all of the media needs some work and some reform, absolutely. But we also need to begin to seek out sources of information and people that we can listen to that aren't confirming our bias all day long. It's great. It tastes good. It feels good, but it's actually not good for us. We need to eat vegetables, not just warm bread with butter.
So can I just jump in with a very quick anecdote? We did this 25-hour live stream back on May 1st. We called it the Call to Unite. We made a commitment to ourselves as we were inviting people to join that we would try to transcend all the boundaries. And the one reaction we got most commonly from people who loved it was that they were so surprised to see people on the screen that they would never go looking for, but who shocked them with how wise and how comforting their voices were. So people who, let's say, come with a sort of a basic biblical religious faith, maybe they came to see Rick Warren and then they met a Sufi mystic. And they were like, whoa. And maybe people who were very interested in police reform came to see Brian Stevenson and then they heard George W. Bush. Or maybe people who were very interested in the pandemic problems came and then they heard a children's choir. And it's been fascinating, Wendy, to listen to people describe the experience of not getting buttered toast, but liking it. And I mean, I'm a little wary of the vegetable analog or metaphor. I think it was more like, wow, I didn't know. It was more being caught off guard because they're not used to tuning in and not getting confirmation bias. And it was kind of alluring to people. So I think there's good television to be created here. I think there's a gap in the market that people would respond to. Not easy. Easier to do Fox and MSNBC than it is to try to thread this needle. But I do think that there's an audience out there. Where there's an audience in the United States, that means there's a market. Where there's a market, there's potential profit, either social or political or economic profit. And any of those might, I think, create opportunities for a new creative kind of social strategy that would help people feel better ultimately. Maybe not just bread and butter, but still a healthier diet that makes them go to sleep at night and say, oh, my tummy feels good tonight. I don't feel all wound up and waking up all through the night with anxiety and anger and all that kind of stuff.
Well, I love vegetables and I love bipartisanship too. And Tim, you should know that was our strategy with the Power Lunch. Everyone's going to come see you, and then they're going to realize,
right.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Done. Mission accomplished. You did it.
Right. I'm just around for the ride. I just add that these are business models for the media, pure and simple business models. It's not real news. It's entertainment models.
That's right.
Let's take the next question here. So this is from Lisa Ruska. How can we train, and who should train, these non-politicians to communicate in a way that doesn't subconsciously promote a view of quote unquote moral superiority or quote unquote othering? Wendy, this is a great question for you. And I think Tim, in many ways, some of your programming is interested in this educational side as well. Mm-hmm. Wendy, you want to maybe take this one first?
Yeah, I'll actually say really quickly that actually what we need to train really all people to do is not communicate better. We need to train them to listen better. There's a great model of what, listening. There's kind of 5 ways that we listen to each other that I always tell people. The first way we listen to people is sort of like on autopilot. It's very often how we listen to our spouse. We're like, yes, honey, yes, honey, yes, honey. We're not really taking it in. And then the second way we listen is also to debate, to answer. Many of us sit in that space all the time. I'm only listening to you and taking enough information to formulate my response and sort of argue back with you or contradict you, right? The third way of listening is empathetic listening. That's the way we listen to people when they break up with their boyfriend or their girlfriend and try to feel the pain of that situation. And then the fourth way to listen, which is the way we want to teach people to listen, is called generative listening. And generative listening means like, I am really listening to you to try to deeply understand you and connect to you and just understand, just have a deeper understanding of really where you're coming from. Only that kind of listening is transformative. If I really know where your pain points are and I really know what's going on for you, that is going to shape the way that I then communicate to you, right? That is going to shape the way I connect to you, or I get you to care about the things that I connect with. So I think we're mostly smart enough that if we could just listen for a little bit longer, we would understand people, and then our communication skills would soar to really new levels. But it really is about teaching people and helping them understand the various levels of listening and how we get better at it.
What a fantastic point and reorientation. I think that's so key. Tim.
Yeah, I mean, Wendy's just done a master class, and I tried to listen as she spoke, and it's really important. These are important lessons. I would just maybe complement this in our work in both social emotional learning and in Unite. We've thought a lot about, is there a didactic, is there a curriculum, is there a new program, if you will, that can train? And I think there are new ways of putting on in the Einstein formulation, a new mindset. The mindset we have that created this problem can't solve it, right? So we need a new mindset. New listening skills are part of it. The other maybe piece of this, just to think about, is the practice of deep and transformative listening, which I would argue most closely aligns with what I'd call service. I don't like the word so much anymore, but there have been Republicans and Democrats for the last 20 years who have challenged the both presidents and legislators to embark on a campaign for almost a rite of passage as national service. My friend John Bridgeland and Alan Casey and General McChrystal are very active in this work. Republicans and Democrats, people who have valued national service through the military as well as in civic and social institutions, faith-based institutions. I bring it up here because in some ways, the practice of the skill also needs a practical way of showing it. And in service, we hear this all the time from our brothers and sisters who've served in the military. We no longer see so much our separate identities. We start to hear and listen and identify with our shared identity. In the military, of course, focused on defending the country in times of greatest danger. But, you know, what a difference it would make if people of all races, ethnicities, genders, backgrounds, persuasions, country clubs and country, coastland and heartland, if we found ourselves at the age of 18 or 22 or 32 or 62 in a year of national service with our brothers and sisters who come from all walks of life in a shared commitment, we would learn to listen, maybe not so much by being told, but by practicing and feeling and sensing the common bonds and the common spirit that unites us.
Thanks so much, Tim. Let's take our final question for the afternoon here. This one comes in from Lou. Lou asks, shouldn't all the federal departments have national unity in mind? And shouldn't that be a priority at the federal and state level? So shouldn't this be something that is thread throughout these organizations? Now, Tim, you really, this is a question I think for all three of you. Tim, you mentioned this idea of at the White House, that's something we could actually thread throughout different departments. Maybe you could expand on that. Wendy, you also mentioned the idea of national unity, perhaps through civil society, how it might connect. Tim, maybe you could go first, and then we'll work our way around.
Well, I think, you know, every time there's something important, there's always two answers. One is put one person in charge of it, and the other is put everyone responsible for it. And that's one of these dichotomies. If you've ever been in a business or tried to run an organization, intuitively, you know it's a both and. So I think the questioner is absolutely right. National unity should be on the agenda of every department, but it may be now that it has been so weakened as a muscle, as a national muscle, it has been so weakened that it needs a decisive leader. And the president, even the president, him or herself, might need an alliance, a vector of power and influence within his or her own administration, in this case, that would be responsible for ensuring that those voices of national unity transcend the various agendas that have so often divided us and push the rest of the systems of government, including the legislative branches, to try to see differently. You know, there's a shift in the lens that is needed here. There's a new, not just something to see, but a new way of seeing. And in my view, is way above my pay grade, I suppose. But my view is that the next president, regardless of which party it is, honestly, I think both parties would do well to consider. We have a Congressional Budget Office, that is neutral from a partisan point of view in evaluating and giving advice to members of Congress. Why not an office in the executive branch, the presidency, whose job it is to identify the shared concerns of Americans of all stripes and walks of life and help bring those constituencies more powerfully. The political advisor is going to be in the president's office every day saying, this is what you got to do for political reasons. Tom knows that, right? They're going to be a national security advisor is going to be in there every day saying, this is what you have to do to protect the American people. This is what we've heard from all the different walks of American life. Why isn't there someone coming in at the same time every day? Here's what you got to do to bring the country together. President doesn't have to do it. Senate doesn't have to act on it. But somebody should be bringing that agenda to the fore to, I think, counterbalance the forces of division that have so taken over.
Wendy, Tim has spoken a lot at the national level, but you and I have spoken offline many times about how, this is something that could, be threaded throughout the American society and go down to state and municipal levels as well.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, I agree with everything Tim said. All I would add is sort of the hyper-local version of that is happening, right, in lots of local communities. So a couple of examples would be, there's an organization called Welcoming America, and they really work with local governments to figure out, particularly in communities that are changing due to demographics and, meatpacking moves in, the community changes rapidly, and the local government wants to do right by everybody, and they want to make sure everybody feels welcome and like they belong in their community. So there really are like courageous and awesome local leaders who do really good stuff. Like the mayor of Cuyahoga Falls, Don Waters, is like one of the best guys ever. And he goes door to door to I swear to God, as soon as someone moves in that neighborhood, he goes to their door and he meets them. And the way he solves conflict is he'll never cite the law. He always says to people, is that neighborly? And it's like it's the greatest thing in the world, because it's not about what the law says you can or can't do, or park 20 cars up in your neighbor's house. It's not neighborly, right? And so there's just really wonderful local leadership that I think obviously you can lift up and show. And then obviously it's like I'm seeing an increasing number of corporations that want to be good, local partners in communities, and as well as like, civil society who realizes that's their role to play. So I think the local energy is there too. No one has enough focus, attention, or resources to do this, right? Like food banks are already working double time, and now they got to build bridges and national unity. So you have to get resources to these organizations, but I think there's a will there. Particularly now, I think this last year has taught us, we sink or swim together, especially in times of difficulty. So I think the will is there. I think we.
And I would just add, I think you're implying this, Wendy, that communities that have had the most economic adversity and the most difficulty, Black and brown communities, are really deeply poor rural communities. These are communities that need an infusion of support for those community-based organizations. They're there ready to do the job. Faith-based organizations, like you say, social service organizations, civic organizations are ready to do this job, but they're wildly under-resourced. And they can't find those resources from within because the resources aren't there. They just don't exist in those communities for a whole host of reasons. So, one of my colleagues, Darius Baxter, is pushing infusions of support for small community-based organizations operating in Black and brown communities. Great idea. Great idea. Same thing should be said of all those communities that have struggled so mightily with really difficult times. And I think you're right. Those local institutions can help lift them, strengthen them, unify them, but also make them more palatable and understanding of those who are coming from very different backgrounds. And that could be a big win for the country.
Just in 1 minute, I think you'll see that innovation at the local level where it makes a lot of sense. At the national level, the governance model now, because Congress has been so dysfunctional, basically is you govern by executive order and regulation and the regulations. And so the elections have consequences. We have a Democratic president. I think he'll put in his people in those regimes to move what parts of the agenda he can, recognizing that legislatively it's going to be very difficult.
And at the state level, Congressman Davis, do you think that that's something that could be implemented at the state level?
Oh, yeah. Your most successful governors, Kasich did that in Ohio. Baker's doing it in Massachusetts. Absolutely, it can work there. Look, we used to say there's not a Republican or Democratic way to fix a pothole. Nowadays, the Republicans want to privatize it, and the Democrats want a project work agreement. So but yes, that's where it can happen.
You sound like someone who may have a gubernatorial race in you in the future. Are you thinking about Virginia?
No, I'm done. I'm done. It's ready for a new generation. But I'm not done with George Mason. That's what you need to know.
Well, that's music to our ears here at George Mason.
Unifier in Chief, Professor Guest, thank you for having us.
Yes,
it's a pleasure, all. Thank you so much for being with us. To our audience, thank you for joining us for this wonderful conversation at a really important time in our nation's history. Next week, please join us again for our panel on healthcare policy. We'll have former Senator and former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, Professor Zeke Emanuel for the Center of American Progress in the University of Pennsylvania, and reporter Sarah Cliff from the New York Times. Thanks for joining us on the Power Lunch. Have a great day.